was late on a rainy night just outside of Moses Lake, Washington, and Julia, a 29-year-old waitress, was nearing the end of her shift at a small diner by the highway. Usually, nights like these meant fewer customers. Not many people braved the rain at this hour, especially in the middle of nowhere. The silence felt heavier that night, with only Julia and Gary, the chef, left in the building. They were both ready to close up and head home, counting down the minutes to 2 a.m. But then, just minutes before closing, the door chimed, and in walked a man. The stranger was broad-shouldered with oddly high-waisted jeans and a faded plaid shirt tucked tightly into his waistband. He had a thick mustache that curved under his glasses, which caught the dim light above, and his grin was wide, too wide. Julia offered a polite smile, though something about his presence set her on edge. She asked if he preferred a seat at the bar or a table. He chose a table, his eyes fixed on her as he settled in, making her skin crawl. He introduced himself as Tony, ordering only a black coffee and some French toast, and kept that unnerving smile locked on his face. Trying to mask her discomfort, Julia took his order to the kitchen, where Gary gave her a knowing look. They were both eager to finish the night, and this last-minute customer didn't help. She brought Tony's coffee, hoping he'd eat and leave quickly, but he seemed determined to talk. Tony started with small talk, but soon his questions grew more personal. "Are you from around here?" he asked. His eyes locked onto hers as if he was studying her reaction. She replied vaguely, saying she lived nearby but didn't offer more. Yet he pressed on, asking if she lived alone, his tone casual, almost too casual. The questions didn't sit well with her. Julia tried to keep the conversation light, steering away from her personal details, hoping he'd lose interest. Tony kept chuckling as he talked, his gaze unwavering, like he was enjoying her discomfort. Gary brought out the food, glancing between her and Tony with an uneasy expression as he placed the plate on the counter. Julia handed Tony his food, giving a subtle nod, hoping he'd focus on eating. But he barely touched his plate, watching her every move. When he finally finished, Julia was quick to bring his check, hinting that it was closing time. He paid, hesitating just a moment before stepping into the rain. As he left, that grin stretched across his face one last time, lingering in her mind long after he disappeared from view. Julia locked the doors and felt a rush of relief, thinking the unsettling encounter was over as she began her closing duties. As soon as Julia locked the doors, she let out a small sigh of relief, glad to have that unsettling customer out of her sight. She finished her final tasks quickly, wiped down the last of the counters, and called out a goodbye to Gary before heading out into the rain-soaked parking lot. Only 3 cars remained. Hers, Gary's, and a third vehicle she didn't recognize, an old silver sedan, parked close to the highway at an odd angle. The car looked weathered, like it had seen its fair share of rough roads. Julia couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it gave her, its darkened windows hiding anything inside. Pushing her suspicions aside, she climbed into her car, started the engine, and began her 20-minute drive home, eager to put the strange encounter with Tony behind her. The rain came down harder, blurring the road and making the familiar route feel longer and more isolating. Julia turned on her wipers to full speed, but they barely kept up with the downpour. She tried to calm herself, thinking about getting home, her mind drifting to the comfort of her warm bed. Suddenly, a loud ding broke her thoughts, drawing her attention to the dashboard. Her stomach tightened as she saw the tire pressure warning light flash on, showing a rapid drop in her rear tire. She barely had time to process what was happening when she felt her car start to shake, a vibration that grew stronger by the second. Pulling off to the side of the road, she felt her pulse quicken. Alone on a dark stretch of highway, her tire completely flat, she realized she had no idea how to fix it and wasn't sure who to call at this hour. She sat in the car, trying to decide what to do, when she noticed a pair of headlights approaching from behind, illuminating the road in an eerie glow. The vehicle slowed, then stopped a short distance away, casting long shadows across her car. Julia's heart pounded as a figure stepped out and approached her window. In the dim glow of the headlights, her stomach dropped as she recognized him. It was Tony, the man from the diner. He walked slowly, tapping on her window with that same unsettling smile stretched across his face. "Julia, right? Car trouble?" he said, his voice carrying a false warmth that made her skin crawl. Julia hesitated, her hand hovering over the door lock, feeling trapped. She forced herself to roll down the window just an inch, enough to speak, but not enough for him to reach inside. "Yeah, looks like it," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Tony's eyes sparkled as he offered to help, his tone too eager, too insistent. He suggested she get out of the car, motioning toward the flat tire. But every instinct in Julia screamed that something was wrong. She managed to smile, telling him she'd wait for her boyfriend instead, hoping it would discourage him from lingering. His smile faltered, irritation flickering in his eyes as he stared at her. Julia's heart raced as she clutched the steering wheel, sensing that Tony wasn't buying her story about waiting for a boyfriend. She watched as his smile twisted, revealing an undercurrent of impatience. Her hand crept down to her phone, and, hoping he wouldn't notice, she dialed 911, letting the phone rest on her lap. Tony began walking around to the back of her car, feigning interest in the flat tire. Using the brief moment he was out of sight, Julia whispered into the phone, explaining her situation as quietly as possible, praying the operator understood the urgency. But then, a sudden crash shattered the quiet. The passenger window burst inward as Tony's fist smashed through the glass, sending shards flying across the seat. Julia screamed, recoiling as Tony reached through the broken window and snatched her phone from her lap. His eyes were wild, his face contorted in anger as he flung the phone into the darkness beyond the road, where it vanished into the rain and mud. She was paralyzed, unable to think or move, her mind reeling as he glared at her through the jagged opening. Without a word, Tony backed away, casting one final, venomous look before turning and rushing to his car. In seconds, he was gone, his taillights disappearing down the highway, swallowed by the night. Julia sat in her car, her breathing ragged, her hands trembling as she tried to process what had just happened. The sound of the rain on her roof seemed deafening, amplifying the oppressive silence that followed. She was stranded, shaken to her core, with no way to call for help. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last, when finally, the faint wail of sirens cut through the rain. Relief washed over her as the red and blue lights emerged in the distance, bouncing off the wet asphalt and casting flashes of color over the road. Julia stumbled out of her car, waving frantically as the police pulled up beside her. 2 officers approached, and she choked out her story, explaining everything about the strange man and her harrowing encounter. They listened intently, their faces grim as they took notes and surveyed the area. The officers changed her tire for her, and one offered to escort her home, his calm presence a welcome comfort after the night's terror. They assured her they would investigate and check the diner's surveillance footage to try and identify Tony. Days passed, and Julia received word that despite their efforts, the man had vanished without a trace, his car unregistered, leaving no clue of his whereabouts. The experience left a scar that ran deeper than she could have imagined. She never returned to the diner, unable to shake the memory of that chilling night. The rain, the broken glass, and the smile that had hinted at something dark and dangerous lurking beneath. It was late October, and the air was crisp, tinged with the scent of fallen leaves as Caleb, a 16-year-old working at the Six Flags amusement park in upstate New York, was counting down the minutes until the end of his shift. He had been at his station for hours, helping guests and keeping an eye on the equipment as the cool wind picked up, stirring the trees. The park was set to close soon for the season, with the last day just a week away. Caleb was tired but relieved, feeling the exhaustion settle in as the park emptied out. Just as he started gathering his things, a man approached. The man looked rough, with a scraggly beard and hair that fell messily around his face. His clothes, a gray t-shirt with faint stains and sweatpants full of holes, seemed out of place for the amusement park. Caleb greeted him, forcing a friendly tone, though a strange tension rose in the pit of his stomach. The man didn't respond at first, only glancing over his shoulder as if he expected someone to be following him. Finally, in a low, almost whispered voice, he asked, "Where are the bathrooms?" Caleb pointed up the hill, giving directions with a professional smile, even as the man stared at him a few moments too long. As he walked away, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling of the man's lingering gaze, his eyes darting back to watch him. He breathed a sigh of relief when one of his co-workers arrived to take his place, and he quickly gathered his things, making his way to the employee area to clock out. After changing out of his uniform and throwing on his jacket, Caleb went to wait for his friend Jordan, who would be picking him up. He sat on a bench in the quiet of the nearly empty parking lot, the silence settling around him, thick and eerie in the dim light. A cool breeze brushed over him, making him pull his jacket tighter around himself. When Jordan finally pulled up, Caleb climbed into the passenger seat, eager to get out of there and put the strange encounter behind him. They decided to stop by a nearby diner for a quick bite, laughing and joking as they walked in, the unsettling feeling of the evening starting to fade. But then, as they sat down and scanned the menu, Caleb's heart stopped. Sitting a few tables away, just within view, was the same man from the park. His gaze was locked on Caleb, unblinking, as if he had been waiting for him to arrive. Caleb's stomach twisted, and he whispered to Jordan, pointing subtly toward the man. Jordan shrugged it off, suggesting it was probably just a coincidence. Trying to convince himself of the same, Caleb looked away, focusing on his food. But every time he glanced up, the man was still there, staring intently, barely touching the coffee cup in front of him. After they finished their meal, Caleb and Jordan left the diner, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. Caleb kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting the man to follow them, but he didn't see him leave. The night was dark and silent as they got into Jordan's car, the streetlights casting long shadows across the parking lot. Caleb tried to brush it off as just a strange encounter with an odd customer, but he couldn't fully convince himself. He could still feel the man's eyes on him, that intense, unblinking stare that seemed to pierce right through him. As they pulled out onto the main road, Caleb settled back into his seat, closing his eyes and trying to let the hum of the engine calm his nerves. But then, at the first red light, he happened to glance out the passenger window. His heart skipped a beat. There, in the next lane, was a white Honda, and behind the wheel sat the same man from the park and the diner. He was watching Caleb through the window, his expression unreadable, his eyes as fixed and unblinking as before. Caleb's skin prickled with fear, and he muttered to Jordan, pointing out the man's car beside them. Jordan finally seemed uneasy too, his casual tone replaced by concern as he glanced over. "That's weird," he admitted, watching as the light turned green, and the man's car slowly began to follow them. They drove through a series of turns, testing to see if he would continue trailing them. But every time they looked back, there he was, just a few cars behind, never losing sight of them. Jordan's voice was tense now. "We'll drive around the block a few times. Make sure he's not still following when I drop you off." They looped around the neighborhood, making sharp turns and even doubling back to see if they could lose him. But no matter where they went, the white Honda was there, always just far enough behind to avoid drawing attention, but close enough that Caleb could still feel his eyes watching him. By the time they reached Caleb's house, he was thoroughly shaken, his mind racing with thoughts of who this man could be and why he was following him. Jordan parked a bit down the street, and they waited in silence, watching to see if the white Honda would appear again. After a few tense minutes, it didn't seem to follow, so they finally felt it was safe for Caleb to head inside. "Call me if anything feels off," Jordan whispered as Caleb got out, glancing around the empty street. Caleb nodded, managing a weak smile before heading to his door, eager to lock himself inside and put the night behind him. He went straight to his room, hoping for some sleep to wash away the fear, but as he settled in, a faint noise caught his attention. A gentle tap, tap, tap at his window. His blood ran cold as he turned, dread creeping up his spine. Through the dark glass, a familiar shape loomed on his front lawn, the man from the diner, standing there in the shadows, smiling directly at his window. Caleb's heart pounded as he stared, frozen, at the dark figure on his lawn. The man's smile stretched wide, his eyes never leaving Caleb's window, piercing through the dim light with a chilling, fixed gaze. Caleb stumbled back from the window, nearly tripping over his desk chair in his rush to grab his phone. His hands shook as he dialed 911, praying for a quick response. The dispatcher's calm voice felt like a lifeline as he described the situation, but his eyes stayed glued to the window, where the man still stood, unmoving, with that same unsettling grin. The moments stretched painfully as Caleb waited, every creak of the house making his pulse race faster. Just when he thought he couldn't bear the tension any longer, flashing red and blue lights appeared at the end of his street, the glow illuminating his room. Caleb's heart swelled with relief, and he dared to peek back out the window. But to his horror, the man was gone. There wasn't a sign of him, not even a shadow retreating into the darkness. He had vanished as suddenly as he'd appeared. Caleb ran to the front door, flinging it open just as two officers approached his house. Breathless and still trembling, he explained everything, from the strange encounter at the amusement park to the man following him to the diner and now his home. The officers took his story seriously, their faces grim as they listened, scanning the yard and surrounding area for any sign of the man. One officer assured him they'd patrol the neighborhood for the rest of the night, and they both encouraged him to stay inside and lock all the doors and windows. After the police left, Caleb returned to his room, still shaken but comforted by the thought that they were nearby. He tried to sleep, but every small sound, the rustling of the trees outside, the creak of the floorboards, jolted him awake, his mind replaying the night's events over and over. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man's eyes were still watching him, lurking somewhere in the shadows. The following day, he called his manager at the amusement park and quit his job, unwilling to risk another encounter with the mysterious man. Weeks passed, and although he tried to return to a normal routine, the memory of that haunting smile stayed with him, lurking in the corners of his mind. Every time he walked through his neighborhood, he felt the man's presence, like a shadow that would never fully disappear. Caleb never saw the man again, but the thought of him remained, an eerie reminder that some things, and some people, are far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. It was nearly midnight, and Madison, a 27-year-old waitress, was wrapping up her shift at a quiet little diner in Casper, Wyoming. The rain poured down heavily outside, drumming against the windows and casting eerie reflections under the dim lights. The few customers who had braved the storm were long gone, and the place was empty, except for Madison and her coworker, Jacob, who was washing up in the kitchen. Nights like these usually meant a peaceful shift, but something about the emptiness of the diner that evening felt different, almost oppressive, as if the storm had brought more than just rain. Just as she began wiping down the last table, the chime over the door rang, making her jump. In walked a man and a young woman. The man looked to be in his early 40s, dressed in a worn leather jacket and jeans. His face was shadowed, his eyes sharp and almost too focused. The woman with him looked barely 20, nervous and quiet, her gaze darting around the diner. Madison greeted them, though the man's intense stare set her on edge. "Table for two?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He nodded, offering a cold, polite smile as he guided the young woman to a booth near the window. They ordered quickly, but something felt off. The man did most of the talking, while the young woman sat silently, fidgeting with her hands in her lap. As Madison took their order, the man struck up a conversation, his tone casual, but his questions oddly probing. He asked if she was from the area, then followed up with questions about her living situation. Madison brushed off the questions, giving vague answers, but she couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling his gaze stirred in her. He seemed to be watching her reactions carefully, almost studying her with an unnerving focus. Once their food arrived, Madison hoped they'd settle down and eat in silence, but the man continued to engage her in conversation each time she passed by. His questions grew stranger, more intrusive. He asked if she enjoyed living alone and commented on how quiet the neighborhood must be. His voice was smooth, too smooth, with a strange emphasis on certain words that made Madison's skin crawl. She glanced over at the young woman, wondering if she, too, felt the man's unsettling presence. But the woman only looked down, her face obscured by her hair, offering no reaction. Finally, the pair finished their meal, leaving a cash tip on the table. Madison watched them go, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering discomfort. She shook off the strange encounter as she began locking up, trying to convince herself it was just another odd customer. But as she glanced out into the parking lot, she noticed their car was still there, sitting in the far corner under the dim light, the engine off, as if they were waiting for something. Or someone. Madison's breath caught as she looked out at the car, its silhouette barely visible through the rain-streaked window. The vehicle sat there in the far corner of the lot, shrouded in darkness, with only a faint glimmer of the streetlight reflecting off the windshield. She could make out the figures of the man and the young woman inside, unmoving, almost statuesque. A shiver crept down her spine, and she quickly turned away, deciding to finish up and get home. It was just an odd couple, she told herself. Nothing more. She called out a quick goodnight to Jacob, who waved from the back and rushed out to her own car, fumbling with her keys in her hurry to leave. The rain had softened to a misty drizzle, but the wind still carried a bite that felt colder than usual. She climbed into her car and locked the doors, giving one last glance toward the corner of the parking lot. The car was still there, and she could have sworn she saw the man's gaze directed at her, his face barely illuminated by the faint light. Madison started her engine, hoping to shake off the feeling of being watched. She backed out of the parking lot and turned onto the road, glancing into her rearview mirror every few seconds, just in case. For a moment, she felt a rush of relief as she drove down the empty street, the diner's glow fading behind her. But then, in her mirror, she saw it. Headlights. The car from the lot pulled out and turned in her direction, following a few car lengths behind. Her heart pounded as she tried to reassure herself that it was nothing, just a coincidence. But the headlights stayed steady, never dropping back, never overtaking her, keeping a perfect distance behind her. Madison took a few random turns, hoping to shake them off, but the car stayed in step, mirroring each move she made. She could feel her palms grow clammy against the steering wheel, her mind racing with possibilities. She'd had unsettling encounters with customers before, but never anything like this. Desperate to confirm her suspicions, Madison took a sharp right turn into a quiet neighborhood, her tires splashing through puddles as she navigated the narrow streets. She slowed down, hoping the car would pass by, but it didn't. Instead, it followed her into the neighborhood, its headlights looming closer now, as if the driver sensed her unease and wanted her to know they were still there. Her breath quickened as she pressed the accelerator, taking random turns down unfamiliar streets, hoping to lose them. But no matter where she went, the headlights stayed close, unwavering and relentless. Finally, she spotted a gas station up ahead, its fluorescent lights spilling out onto the road like a beacon of safety. She pulled in quickly, parking near the entrance, hoping the lit area would make them think twice. For a moment, she sat there, watching the road behind her, waiting for the car to appear again. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last, until finally the road remained empty. She let out a shaky breath, thinking maybe she'd lost them, or maybe they just decided to stop the chase. Madison sat in her car at the gas station, her heart pounding, watching the empty road with bated breath. The fluorescent lights of the station felt like a temporary shield, but the unease wouldn't leave her. After a few minutes of silence, she tried to convince herself it was over, that whoever was following her had given up. But just as she started to relax, a familiar pair of headlights appeared at the end of the road, slowly growing brighter as the car made its way toward her. Her stomach dropped as the vehicle rolled into the gas station lot and stopped at a distance, facing her. She couldn't see inside the car through the rain-speckled windshield, but she didn't need to. She knew it was him. Madison's mind raced, trying to think of what to do. She grabbed her phone, debating whether to call 911, but her hands were shaking too badly to dial. She forced herself to take deep breaths, glancing toward the convenience store entrance, weighing whether she should make a run for it. Just then, the car's headlights blinked off, and the driver's side door opened. Madison's heart leapt into her throat as she saw the man from the diner step out. He stood there for a moment, rain drenching his shoulders, his face barely visible under the dim gas station lights. Then he began to walk toward her, slowly and deliberately, his gaze fixed on her car with that same chilling intensity as in the diner. Without thinking, Madison locked her doors and slid lower in her seat, praying he'd lose interest. But he continued forward, his footsteps echoing on the wet pavement until he was standing just outside her window. She couldn't bring herself to look up, but she could feel his presence, feel his eyes on her. He raised a hand and tapped on her window, each tap sending a spike of fear through her body. She forced herself to look, meeting his eyes through the glass. His face was devoid of expression, a cold, unreadable mask. "Miss, are you lost?" he asked, his voice calm and measured, almost friendly. Madison shook her head, her throat too tight to speak, her fingers gripping the steering wheel. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only a thinly veiled menace. "Are you sure?" he pressed, his fingers lingering on the window. "It's a lonely road out here. Wouldn't want anything to happen to you." She managed to mumble something, anything, hoping he'd take it as a dismissal, but he didn't move. Instead, he leaned in closer, his gaze unwavering, his breath fogging up the window. "Maybe you'd like some company," he said softly, his voice dripping with sinister intent. At that moment, she couldn't take it anymore. In a burst of adrenaline, she threw her car into reverse, tires screeching as she backed out and sped away from the gas station. She drove through the night without looking back, her heart racing, her mind swirling with terror. When she finally reached home, she locked every door and window, her hands still shaking as she tried to process what had happened. Days passed, but the fear never left. She couldn't shake the memory of the man's smile, the way he looked at her with that cold, unyielding gaze. She knew, deep down, that she'd never feel truly safe again. That some encounters haunt you forever, lingering in the dark corners of your mind.